The winter of 1991 came to Silver Hollow, Colorado like a closing fist. Snow began falling on October 29th and didn't stop for 3 days straight, blanketing the mountain town in an early silence that felt different from other years. The locals, weathered by decades of harsh winters, watched the accumulation with growing unease. By November 2nd, the mountain pass connecting Silver Hollow to the outside world had narrowed to a single lane, and the radio crackled with warnings about travel conditions. Daniel Mercer had been visiting Silver Hollow for the weekend, drawn by the promise of one last hiking expedition before winter sealed the high country trails. At 19, he was a sophomore at the University of Colorado Boulder, studying geology with the kind of quiet intensity that impressed his professors. His friends described him as methodical, careful, the type who always carried backup batteries for his flashlight and left detailed itineraries with his roommate. That weekend, Daniel had been staying at the Pine Ridge Motel, a small establishment on Main Street run by Margaret Chen, a woman who had moved to Silver Hollow in 1987 after her husband's death. She remembered Daniel clearly because he had asked unusual questions during check-in. While most visitors inquired about trail conditions or weather forecasts, Daniel wanted to know about the old mining operations that had once dominated the area. He pulled out this topographical map. Margaret would later tell investigators, her voice steady but distant. It was covered in pencil marks and notes. He asked me if I knew anything about the sealed mine entrances up on Echo Ridge. Said he was doing research for a paper about abandoned mining sites in Colorado. Margaret had lived in Silver Hollow long enough to know that locals didn't talk much about the old mines. The operations had closed in the 1950s, after a series of cave-ins that claimed 6 lives. The entrances had been dynamited shut and marked with warning signs that weather and time had since eroded. Most residents preferred to let that chapter of their town's history remain buried. Daniel spent Saturday, November 2nd, hiking the lower trails around Echo Ridge. The temperature hovered just above freezing, and a thin layer of ice made the rocks treacherous. He returned to the motel around 4 p.m., his boots caked with mud and early snow. Margaret noticed he seemed excited, almost agitated, as he climbed the stairs to his room. Through the thin walls, she could hear him making phone calls, though she couldn't make out the words. The last person to speak with Daniel was his roommate, Eric Sandler, back in Boulder. Eric was studying for a chemistry exam when his phone rang at 6:47 p.m. He almost didn't answer, but something about the persistent ringing made him pick up. Danny sounded different. Eric would tell police 3 days later, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long gone cold. Usually, he was so calm, so measured in how he spoke. But that night, there was this energy in his voice. He said he'd made an incredible discovery up on the mountain. Said he'd found evidence of something that had been hidden for decades. Eric pressed for details, but Daniel remained vague. He mentioned finding documentation and proof of what really happened. When Eric asked what he meant, Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. He said he needed to verify something first, that he would explain everything when he got back to Boulder the next day. The call ended abruptly. Eric heard what sounded like wind, then Daniel's voice, distant and unclear, saying something that might have been, "I found it," or "I found him." Then the line went dead. Daniel checked out of the Pine Ridge Motel at 8:15 a.m. on November 3rd. Margaret remembered the exact time because she had been watching the morning news. Concerned about the weather forecast, predicting another storm front moving in from the west, Daniel seemed hurried, distracted. He paid his bill in cash and declined her offer of coffee and directions for the safest route back to Boulder. "Drive carefully," she had called after him as he loaded his red 1987 Subaru wagon. "That pass can get dangerous quick when the weather turns." Daniel nodded and waved, then pulled out of the motel parking lot and headed toward the mountain road that would take him home. It was the last time anyone in Silver Hollow saw him alive. The red Subaru was discovered at 2:47 p.m. that same afternoon by Jake Morrison, a Forest Service employee conducting routine maintenance checks on the access roads. The car sat on a narrow service road approximately 8 miles from town, positioned as if Daniel had deliberately pulled over. The engine was off, but the keys remained in the ignition. The doors were locked. Jake's first thought was that the driver had stepped away briefly, perhaps to take photographs or answer nature's call. The car's position wasn't particularly dangerous, though the service road was rarely used and led only to an old fire tower that had been abandoned for years. Jake waited 15 minutes, then tried calling out, When no one responded, he used his radio to contact the sheriff's department. Sheriff Robert Hayes arrived at the scene 45 minutes later, accompanied by Deputy Linda Vasquez. They found Daniel's car exactly as Jake had described it, locked keys in the ignition. No signs of struggle or forced entry. The gas tank was 3/4 full. Daniel's duffel bag sat in the back seat, neatly packed, as if he had been planning to continue his journey. What struck both officers as odd was the car's position relative to the main road. To reach the service road, Daniel would have had to make a deliberate turn and drive nearly a quarter mile through increasingly rough terrain. There was no logical reason for someone heading back to Boulder to venture onto this particular route. Inside the car, investigators found Daniel's wallet containing his driver's license, student ID, and $43 in cash. His camera bag held a 35mm Canon and several rolls of undeveloped film. A thermos of coffee, still warm, sat in the cup holder. On the passenger seat lay the topographical map Margaret had mentioned, covered in Daniel's careful handwriting and marked with a red circle around an area labeled Old Mine Trail Ridge Access. The first search began that evening as temperatures dropped toward zero. Volunteers from Silver Hollow joined Forest Service personnel and sheriff's deputies in combing the immediate area around the abandoned car. They called Daniel's name until their voices grew hoarse, their flashlight beams cutting through the gathering darkness and the snow that had begun falling again. Dr. Patricia Wells, Daniel's geology professor, drove up from Boulder when she heard about the disappearance. She had known Daniel for 2 years and considered him one of her most promising students. When investigators showed her the marked map found in his car, her expression grew troubled. Daniel had been working on an independent study project about historical mining operations in Colorado. She explained to Sheriff Hayes he was particularly interested in sites where official records seemed incomplete or contradictory. He believed there were stories that hadn't been properly documented. Dr. Wells examined the red circle on Daniel's map. The area it marked corresponded to a section of Echo Ridge where old mining claims had been registered in the 1940s, but according to county records, no significant operations had ever been established there. Daniel had apparently found this discrepancy intriguing. He came to my office 2 weeks ago, Dr. Wells continued, asking about geological survey techniques for locating sealed or hidden mine entrances. I told him it was dangerous work, that old mines were unpredictable and often unstable. But Daniel was thorough in his research. If he thought there was something worth investigating, he would have prepared carefully. As the search entered its second day, the weather worsened. Snow fell steadily, accumulating at a rate that made tracking impossible. The temperature remained below freezing, and wind gusts reached 30 miles per hour. Search teams were forced to retreat repeatedly as visibility dropped to near zero. On November 5th, searchers found Daniel's first clear footprints leading away from his car. The prints headed northeast, directly toward the area marked on his map. They were deep and well-defined, suggesting Daniel had been carrying something heavy. After approximately 200 yards, the prints veered toward a cluster of pine trees and then simply vanished, as if Daniel had been lifted into the air. The search teams expanded their grid, working outward from the last confirmed footprints. They discovered evidence that someone had recently disturbed the area around several large boulders, as if attempting to move or examine them. Scrape marks in the dirt suggested heavy objects had been shifted, though searchers could find no indication of what Daniel might have been looking for. Margaret Chen organized a meal service for the search volunteers, setting up a station in the Silver Hollow Community Center, where exhausted searchers could warm up and refuel. She noticed that many of the older residents seemed reluctant to discuss the area where Daniel had disappeared. When she mentioned the old mine trail to Harold Ruskin, a 73-year-old who had lived in Silver Hollow his entire life, his expression darkened. "That ridge has always been trouble," Harold muttered, stirring sugar into his coffee with deliberate precision. "My father used to say there were things up there that ought to stay buried. Some secrets are meant to keep." When Margaret pressed for details, Harold simply shook his head and walked away. The search for Daniel Mercer consumed Silver Hollow for 3 weeks. By November 10th, the operation had expanded to include search and rescue teams from 3 counties, volunteer groups from Boulder and Denver, and a specialized unit trained in wilderness recovery. The small mountain town, accustomed to quiet winters and predictable routines, found itself at the center of a media attention that felt both welcome and intrusive. Sheriff Hayes established a command post at the Silver Hollow fire station, where maps covered every available wall surface, and radio chatter provided a constant backdrop of coordinates, weather updates, and negative report. The red circle on Daniel's map had become the focal point of search efforts, but the terrain proved more challenging than anyone had anticipated. Echo Ridge rose sharply from the valley floor, its slopes covered with dense stands of lodgepole, pine, and aspen that created a maze of similar-looking clearings and ravines. The old mining claims Daniel had been researching were scattered across nearly 4 square miles of mountainside, connected by game trails and forgotten service roads that appeared on no current maps. Search teams worked methodically through each sector, calling Daniel's name and listening for any response. The November cold was brutal, with nighttime temperatures dropping as low as 15 below zero. Hypothermia became a constant concern, not just for the missing student, but for the searchers themselves. Dr. Patricia Wells remained in Silver Hollow throughout the search, serving as a liaison between the search teams and Daniel's family. She spent her days studying the marked map found in Daniel's car, trying to understand what had drawn her student to this particular area. The more she researched, the more puzzled she became. The geological surveys from the 1940s show mineral samples consistent with gold and silver deposits, she explained to Sheriff Hayes during a briefing on November 12. But the extraction records don't match the survey data. Either the mining operations were much smaller than the survey suggested, or someone removed materials without proper documentation. Hayes studied the faded papers Dr. Wells had obtained from the county courthouse. The discrepancies were subtle but consistent. Claims filed for specific coordinates showed no corresponding extraction permits. Equipment manifests listed machinery deliveries to sites where no roads existed. Workers' compensation records referenced accidents at operations that officially never began production. Could Daniel have discovered something about these inconsistencies? Hayes asked. It's possible, Dr. Wells replied. Daniel was fascinated by what he called hidden histories, situations where official records obscured, rather than revealed, the truth. He believed that careful geological analysis could uncover evidence that paperwork tried to bury. On November 14th, the search teams made their first significant discovery. Approximately half a mile from Daniel's car, following a faint trail that switchbacked up the steepest part of the ridge, searchers found a blue backpack wedged between 2 fallen logs. The pack was immediately recognizable, as Daniel's his roommate, Eric, had seen him carrying it dozens of times around campus. Inside the backpack, investigators found items that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. Daniel's journal contained detailed notes about his weekend in Silver Hollow, including sketches of rock formations and careful measurements of distances between various landmarks. The most recent entries, dated November 2nd, described finding evidence of recent excavation and clear signs that someone has been accessing the sealed areas. The journal's final entry, written in Daniel's precise handwriting, read, "The official story about the mine closures doesn't match the physical evidence. Someone has been maintaining access to at least 3 of the tunnel systems. Found fresh tool marks on the barrier stones and clear paths that are being kept open. Tomorrow, I'll document everything and take samples back to Dr. Wells for analysis." Also in the backpack was Daniel's compass, a detailed topographical map of the Echo Ridge area marked with GPS coordinates, and a 35mm camera loaded with partially exposed film. Most intriguingly, searchers found a manila envelope containing photocopied documents that appeared to be historical mining permits and worker records dating from 1947 to 1952. Dr. Wells examined the photocopied documents with growing confusion. The papers described mining operations at locations that, according to current records, had never been developed. Worker rosters listed men with names that didn't appear in any Silver Hollow historical records. Equipment inventories referenced tunneling machinery far more sophisticated than anything typically used in small-scale mountain mining operations of the 1940s. Where did Daniel get these documents? Sheriff Hayes asked. I have no idea, Dr. Wells admitted. This isn't the kind of information that would be available in any standard archive. Someone with access to private or sealed records would have had to provide these to him. The discovery of Daniel's backpack shifted the search focus. Teams concentrated on the area where the pack had been found, using metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar to locate any additional evidence. The terrain was treacherous, with loose rock and hidden crevices that could easily trap or injure a lone hiker. On November 16th, searchers discovered the first of what would eventually be identified as deliberately concealed mine entrances. Hidden behind a carefully arranged pile of boulders and overgrown with 20 years of vegetation, a narrow opening led into the mountainside. The concealment was so complete that the entrance was invisible unless viewed from a specific angle. The discovery violated everything the search teams thought they knew about the area's mining history. According to official records, all mine entrances on Echo Ridge had been permanently sealed with explosives in 1954. The hidden opening suggested that either the sealing operation had been incomplete or someone had reopened access points that were supposed to remain permanently closed. Sheriff Hayes contacted the state mining authority, requesting historical records about the 1954 sealing operation. The response was frustrating in its incompleteness. The files contained general documentation about the decision to close the mines following safety violation, but specific details about which entrances were sealed and how the work was conducted had apparently been lost or misfiled decades earlier. It's as if someone deliberately made this information difficult to find, Hayes told his deputy, Linda Vasquez, as they reviewed the sparse documentation. The search teams were forbidden from entering the discovered mine entrance due to safety concerns. Without proper equipment and expertise, exploration of potentially unstable underground passages was considered too dangerous. However, searchers did examine the entrance area thoroughly, finding evidence that someone had recently accessed the tunnel system. Footprints in the soft earth around the opening were partially obscured by recent snowfall, but clear enough to confirm that at least one person had entered and exited the mine within the past 2 weeks. The prints matched the size and tread pattern of Daniel's hiking boots. Inside the entrance, just within reach of flashlight beams, searchers spotted what appeared to be fresh scratches on the tunnel walls, marks that could have been made by someone trying to navigate in limited light. A few feet into the passage, they found a small pile of loose rock that seemed to have been deliberately arranged, possibly as a marker or signal. Margaret Chen, who had been providing meals for search volunteers throughout the operation, noticed a change in the behavior of Silver Hollow's older residents as news of the mine discovery spread through town. Men who had previously offered assistance and local knowledge suddenly became reluctant to discuss the search. Conversations stopped when she entered the general store or post office. It was like a curtain had come down. She would later tell investigators. People who had been talking openly about Daniel and the search suddenly acted like they didn't want to know anything about what was happening up on the ridge. Harold Ruskin, the elderly resident who had made cryptic comments about buried secrets, began avoiding the community center entirely. When Margaret encountered him at the grocery store, he seemed agitated and distracted. "You don't understand what you're stirring up," Harold told her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some things happened in this town that were supposed to stay finished. That boy had no business poking around where he didn't belong." Margaret asked Harold to explain what he meant, but he simply shook his head and hurried away, leaving his groceries unpaid for on the counter. The search for Daniel Mercer officially ended on November 24th, 3 weeks after his disappearance. Weather conditions had deteriorated to the point where continued operations posed unacceptable risks to search personnel. Snow depth in the target area exceeded 4 feet, and temperatures remained consistently below zero. Sheriff Hayes announced that the search would resume in spring, when conditions improved. Daniel's parents, Robert and Susan Mercer, arrived from their home in Kansas for the final briefing. They were quiet, dignified people who had raised their son to be careful and responsible. The idea that Daniel had simply gotten lost or injured in a hiking accident seemed incompatible with everything they knew about his character. Daniel wouldn't have taken unnecessary risks, his father told the assembled search team. If he went into those mountains, he had a specific purpose and a plan. Someone knows what happened to him. The case file remained open, but active investigation essentially ceased with the end of the search operation. Daniel's red Subaru was towed to the Sheriff's Department impound lot, where it would sit for months while investigators hoped for new leads that never materialized. Eric Sandler returned to Boulder and struggled to complete the semester. He found himself replaying his final conversation with Daniel obsessively, trying to extract meaning from words that remained frustratingly vague. The excitement in Daniel's voice that night had been unmistakable, but excitement about what? What discovery could have been important enough to risk his safety in deteriorating weather conditions? Dr. Wells continued her analysis of the documents found in Daniel's backpack, but without additional context, they remained more puzzling than illuminating. The photocopied mining records suggested a level of activity on Echo Ridge that contradicted every official account of the area's history. Yet, tracking down the source of these documents proved impossible. Daniel had apparently never mentioned them to anyone, and his research methods remained a mystery. As winter deepened, Silver Hollow returned to its normal rhythms. The media attention faded, and the command post at the fire station was dismantled. The hidden mine entrance discovered during the search was sealed with a steel grate and warning signs, though some residents privately questioned whether that would be sufficient to prevent future incidents. Margaret Chen noticed that the older residents seemed relieved when the search ended. Conversations in the general store and post office resumed their normal patterns, and the sense of uncomfortable tension that had pervaded the town during November gradually dissipated. But the questions remained. What had Daniel Mercer discovered that excited him enough to risk everything? Who had provided him with documents that officially didn't exist? And why did the mention of his research seem to frighten people who had lived on Echo Ridge their entire lives? The winter of 1991-1992 was one of the harshest in Colorado history. Snow continued falling through March, creating drifts that reached the second-story windows of buildings in Silver Hollow. The mountain pass remained closed for weeks at a time, isolating the town from the outside world. During those long, quiet months, residents noticed strange phenomena that they rarely discussed with outsiders. Hikers reported hearing sounds from the direction of Echo Ridge, rhythmic tapping that echoed through the valley on still nights. The local radio station occasionally picked up brief transmissions on abandoned frequency, fragments of voices that seemed to be counting or reciting coordinates. Margaret Chen, working late at the motel one February night, saw lights moving slowly across the ridge. The illumination was too steady and deliberate to be natural phenomena, but too distant to identify clearly. When she mentioned the sighting to Sheriff Hayes the next morning, he assured her that no authorized activities were taking place in the search area. Could be snowmobilers, Hayes suggested, though they both knew the terrain on Echo Ridge was too steep and dangerous for recreational vehicles. As spring approached and the snow began to melt, some residents hoped that Daniel's remains would finally be discovered, providing closure to a mystery that had haunted the town for months. Others privately worried about what else the receding snow might reveal. The truth, whatever it was, remained buried beneath layers of ice, silence, and secrets that ran deeper than anyone imagined. 13 years passed before Echo Ridge surrendered its first real clue. The spring of 2004 brought an unusually rapid snowmelt to the Colorado Rockies. Decades of accumulated snow and ice retreated in a matter of weeks, revealing landscapes that hadn't been visible since the early 1990s. Rivers ran higher than anyone could remember, and hiking trails that had been impassable for years suddenly opened to reveal terrain altered by more than a decade of freeze-thaw cycles. Sarah Martinez had been hiking the Echo Ridge area since childhood, long before Daniel Mercer's disappearance made the mountain infamous. At 28, she worked as a freelance photographer, specializing in wilderness landscapes, and the dramatic snowmelt presented opportunities for unique shots of exposed rock formations and seasonal waterfall. On the morning of April 17, 2004, Sarah was photographing a section of the ridge, approximately 2 miles from where Daniel's car had been found. The area had been thoroughly searched in 1991, but 13 years of weather had rearranged the landscape considerably. Fallen trees created new clearings, and seasonal streams had carved fresh channels through the forest floor. Sarah was adjusting her camera settings when she noticed something unusual about the light. Filtering through a grove of aspen trees, the morning sun, striking the grove from a specific angle, illuminated what appeared to be a geometric shape, partially buried beneath years of accumulated debris. Moving closer, she discovered a wooden structure, weathered but clearly man-made, protruding from what had once been a carefully concealed depression in the forest floor. The structure appeared to be the upper portion of a small cabin or shelter, built from hand-hewn logs and constructed with the kind of attention to detail that suggested permanent rather than temporary occupation. Sarah cleared away enough debris to reveal a wooden door, warped by years of moisture, but still intact. The door was secured with a simple metal latch that, despite its age, moved freely when she tested it. The preservation was remarkable. as if the structure had been protected by some combination of location, construction technique, and pure chance. The door opened onto a steep set of wooden steps, descending into darkness. Sarah's first impulse was to leave immediately and report her discovery to authorities, but something about the careful construction and hidden location suggested this wasn't simply an abandoned hunting cabin or mining shelter. Using her camera's flash as illumination, Sarah descended the first few steps and discovered that the structure was larger than its surface appearance suggested. The wooden cabin was actually the entrance to a more extensive underground complex, carved into the mountainside with precision that spoke of significant time and resources. The air inside was surprisingly fresh, suggesting some form of ventilation system. The wooden steps, though worn, remained solid underfoot. After approximately 20 steps, Sarah emerged into a chamber roughly 12 feet square, with walls that appeared to have been reinforced with concrete and steel supports. The chamber contained items that immediately suggested this wasn't an ordinary mining operation or wilderness shelter. Along one wall stood several metal filing cabinets, their surfaces dusty but otherwise well preserved. A wooden desk held papers and documents, arranged as if someone had simply stepped away temporarily. Most remarkably, electric lights hung from the ceiling, connected to wiring that disappeared into conduits, leading deeper into the mountain. Sarah photographed everything methodically before touching anything. Her training as a documentary photographer had taught her the importance of preserving scenes exactly as discovered. The flash from her camera revealed details that natural light couldn't illuminate: maps pinned to the wall, technical drawings scattered across the desk surface, and boxes of equipment stacked along the chamber's far wall. The maps were particularly intriguing. They showed Echo Ridge in far greater detail than any public survey, marking locations that corresponded to the hidden mine entrances discovered during the 1991 search. Red ink indicated what appeared to be tunnel systems, connecting multiple sites, creating an underground network that extended for miles beneath the mountain. On the desk, Sarah found a leather-bound logbook filled with entries dating from 1947 to 1953. The handwriting was careful and precise, documenting activities that seemed part mining operation, part scientific research. Entries described specimen collection, structural testing, and security protocols in language that suggested something far more sophisticated than typical mining activities. One entry, dated September 15, 1952, caught Sarah's attention. New protocols established for surface concealment, all access points to be camouflaged using natural materials, operations to continue indefinitely, but without surface visibility. Personnel rotation schedule, adjusted to minimize local awareness. The filing cabinets contained hundreds of documents, equipment, inventories, personnel records, geological surveys, and correspondence with organizations whose letterheads bore government seals and corporate logos Sarah didn't recognize. The papers suggested a level of coordination between multiple agencies and private companies that seemed extraordinary for what was supposedly a small-scale mining operation. Sarah spent nearly 2 hours documenting the chamber before venturing deeper into the complex. The main chamber connected to a tunnel that sloped gradually downward, lined with the same concrete and steel construction. Emergency lighting activated automatically as she moved, suggesting that power was still being supplied to the facility decades after its supposed abandonment. The tunnel led to additional chambers, each serving apparent specialized functions. One room contained equipment that looked like radio communication gear, though far more sophisticated than anything Sarah recognized. Another held what appeared to be laboratory equipment, microscopes, testing apparatus, and storage containers arranged with scientific precision. In the largest chamber, approximately 50 feet beneath the surface, Sarah discovered something that changed her understanding of everything she had found. Against the far wall stood a massive steel vault door, circular and heavy, with combination locks and warning signs indicating authorized personnel only. The door was slightly ajar. Inside the vault, Sarah found documents that explained both the hidden nature of the operation and its apparent connection to Daniel Mercer's disappearance 13 years earlier. The papers described a classified government research project conducted during the early Cold War years, using the remote Echo Ridge location to test geological survey techniques and underground construction, methods that would later be applied to military installations. The project, codenamed Deep Shelter, had been officially terminated in 1954, but the documents revealed that a skeleton crew had maintained the facility through the 1960s and beyond. The reason for this extended operation wasn't clearly stated, but references to ongoing monitoring and security maintenance suggested that whatever had been discovered or developed at Echo Ridge required permanent oversight. Most significantly, Sarah found a personnel file folder marked Civilian Contacts -1991. Inside were photocopied documents she immediately recognized, the same historical mining permits and worker records that had been found in Daniel Mercer's backpack during the search 13 years earlier. A handwritten note clipped to the documents was dated November 1, 1991, 2 days before Daniel's disappearance. The note read, "Subject has made contact, requesting additional documentation. Recommend immediate termination of civilian access. Security protocols may have been compromised." The note was unsigned, but attached was a photograph of Daniel Mercer, taken with a telephoto lens, apparently without his knowledge. In the image, Daniel stood near his red Subaru, examining the topographical map that would later be found in his car. The photograph's date stamp showed it had been taken on November 2, 1991, Daniel's final day in Silver Hollow. Sarah's hands trembled as she photographed the documents. The implications were staggering. Daniel hadn't simply stumbled upon historical inconsistencies in mining record. He had somehow made contact with people who were actively maintaining a classified facility that officially didn't exist. His research had led him to secrets that someone was willing to kill to protect. Additional documents in the vault revealed the extent of the ongoing operation. Monthly reports stretched from the 1950s through the early 1990s, describing routine maintenance, security checks, and procedures for incident management. The reports were filed by different individuals over the decades, but all bore the same organizational code, DS7 Mountain Operations. One report, dated November 15, 1991, provided a clinical account of what had happened to Daniel Mercer. Civilian breach contained, subject neutralized during attempt to document restricted areas, remains disposed of according to standard protocols, surface evidence eliminated, local authorities redirected to acceptable search parameters. The matter-of-fact language made Sarah's stomach turn. Daniel hadn't died in a hiking accident or gotten lost in the wilderness. He had been murdered by people sworn to protect a secret that the government had decided was more important than one student's life. Sarah found additional evidence that the killing hadn't been spontaneous. Surveillance reports documented Daniel's activities from the moment he arrived in Silver Hollow, tracking his conversations with local residents and his movements around the mountain. The operation had been watching him long before he made his fatal discovery. The final document in Daniel's file was a memo recommending enhanced security measures to prevent future civilian breaches. The recommendations included increased monitoring of academic research into the area's history, and the establishment of local informants who could report suspicious inquiries about Echo Ridge's past. Sarah realized with growing horror that the older residents of Silver Hollow hadn't been naturally reluctant to discuss the mountain's secrets. They had been actively recruited to help conceal a murder. As she prepared to leave the vault, Sarah noticed one additional detail that sent chills down her spine. The facility's power systems, communication equipment, and security measures were all functioning perfectly. The hidden complex wasn't simply being maintained, it was still actively operational. Someone was still working at Echo Ridge, still protecting secrets that had cost Daniel Mercer his life. And now, Sarah had discovered evidence that could expose not just a 13-year-old murder, but an ongoing government operation that continued to pose a threat to anyone who got too close to the truth. The emergency lighting that had activated when she entered the facility meant that her presence had been detected. Somewhere in the complex, systems were recording her unauthorized access. The same people who had killed Daniel Mercer would soon know that their secret had been compromised again. Sarah gathered the most critical documents, photographed everything she could carry, and began the climb back to the surface. The morning sun felt different when she emerged from the hidden entrance, brighter and more precious, because she now understood how easily it could be taken away. As she secured the concealed door and prepared to hike back to her vehicle, Sarah noticed fresh footprints in the soft earth around the entrance. The prints were recent, made within the past few days, and they led deeper into the forest in a direction she hadn't explored. Someone else knew about the hidden facility, someone who might already be aware of her discovery. Sarah began walking quickly toward her truck, fighting the urge to run. Behind her, the mountain held its secrets a little less securely than it had that morning. But revealing those secrets, she now realized, would require surviving long enough to share them with the world. The forest seemed different as she made her way down the trail, quieter, more watchful, as if the trees themselves were complicit in the deception that had claimed Daniel Mercer's life, and might soon claim hers. Sarah Martinez reached her truck without incident, but the drive down from Echo Ridge felt like the longest journey of her life. Every curve in the mountain road seemed to hide potential threats. Every vehicle she encountered might contain people who knew what she had discovered. The documents in her camera bag felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. Back in her apartment in Boulder, Sarah spread the photographs across her dining room table and tried to process the magnitude of what she had uncovered. The evidence was overwhelming. Daniel Mercer had been murdered by operatives protecting a classified government facility that had been operating in secret for over 50 years. But Sarah faced the same dilemma that had ultimately cost Daniel his life. Who could she trust with information this sensitive? Local law enforcement had been compromised in 1991, redirected away from the truth by people with federal authority. The FBI and other agencies might be directly involved in the cover-up. Even journalists and academics could be monitored or influenced by the same networks that had kept the secret for decades. Sarah decided her first call should be to the one person who had never stopped seeking answers about Daniel's disappearance: his former roommate, Eric Sandler. Eric was now 32 years old, working as a chemistry teacher at a high school in Denver. He had married, started a family, and built a successful career. But he had never forgotten the friend who had vanished after that excited phone call 13 years earlier. When Sarah contacted him and explained what she had found, Eric's response was immediate and decisive. "We need to meet in person," he said. "And we need to be very careful about how we handle this." They arranged to meet at a coffee shop in downtown Denver, far from Silver Hollow, and away from any location that might be under surveillance. Sarah brought printouts of the most critical photographs, while Eric carried a folder containing everything he had preserved from Daniel's final weeks: notes, research materials, and correspondence that he had kept hoping someday it might prove relevant. Comparing Sarah's discoveries with Eric's preserved materials created a clear timeline of how Daniel had been drawn into the web of secrets surrounding Echo Ridge. The process had begun weeks before his fatal trip to Silver Hollow, when Daniel's academic research into mining discrepancies had apparently triggered automated monitoring systems designed to flag suspicious inquiries. "Look at this," Eric said, pulling out a letter Daniel had received in October 1991. The letter, typed on plain paper with no official letterhead, purported to be from a mining history researcher who claimed to have additional information about Echo Ridge operations. The letter suggested a meeting in Silver Hollow to exchange documents and discuss findings. Daniel was so excited when he got this, Eric recalled. He said someone else had been researching the same inconsistencies he'd discovered. But now it's obvious, this was how they made contact with him. Sarah compared the letter to the surveillance reports she had found in the underground facility. The timeline matched perfectly. Daniel's correspondent hadn't been a fellow researcher. It had been an operative tasked with assessing the threat Daniel posed to the Deep Shelter Project. The surveillance reports painted a picture of a young man whose academic curiosity had inadvertently penetrated one of the government's most closely guarded secrets. Daniel's research methods were thorough and systematic. Exactly the qualities that made him an excellent student and a potential security risk. Initial contact had been designed to determine how much Daniel knew and whether he could be discouraged from further investigation. When it became clear that Daniel was too persistent and had developed too many leads to abandon his research safely, the decision had been made to eliminate him. "They killed him because he was good at what he did," Sarah said, her voice heavy with the tragedy of it. "If he had been less thorough, less dedicated, he might still be alive." Eric nodded, staring at a photograph of Daniel taken during their college year. Danny always said that half-answered questions bothered him more than unsolved problems. He couldn't let go of anything that didn't make sense. Sarah and Eric spent hours developing a plan for safely revealing what they had discovered. The stakes were enormous. not just for exposing Daniel's murder, but for revealing an ongoing government operation that continued to pose a threat to civilian safety. They decided to approach the story through multiple channels simultaneously, making it impossible for any single point of intervention to stop the truth from emerging. Eric would contact Daniel's former professor, Dr. Patricia Wells, who was now department head at the University of Colorado, and had connections with investigative journalists. Sarah would reach out to documentary filmmakers who specialized in government accountability stories. Most importantly, they would create multiple copies of all evidence and distribute them to trusted individuals who could ensure the story would survive, even if something happened to the primary investigators. Dr. Wells, now in her 60s, agreed to meet with Eric and Sarah after he explained the general nature of their discoveries. Her office in the geology building looked exactly as it had 13 years earlier, filled with rock samples, technical journals, and photographs of field research sites. When Sarah spread the photographs of the deep shelter documents across Dr. Wells' desk, the professor's face went through a series of expressions: shock, recognition, and finally, a deep sadness that seemed to age her visibly. "I suspected something like this might be the truth," Dr. Wells said quietly. "Daniel's research was too good, too thorough, for him to simply get lost in the mountain. But I could never prove it, and after a while, it seemed safer not to ask too many questions." Dr. Wells revealed that she had continued investigating Daniel's disappearance unofficially for several years after the search ended. Her inquiries had led to subtle but unmistakable pressure from university administrators to focus on other research areas. Funding for projects related to Colorado mining history had dried up, and graduate students interested in similar topics had been steered toward different specializations. "The academic community is smaller than people realize," Dr. Wells explained. "Word gets around about which topics are problematic, which researchers ask inconvenient questions. Daniel's disappearance sent a message that some areas of inquiry weren't welcome." Sarah shared additional photographs showing the extent of the deep shelter facility and evidence of its continued operation. Dr. Wells examined the technical documents with growing amazement. "This represents millions of dollars in construction and decades of maintenance," she said. "Whatever they're protecting must be extraordinarily valuable or dangerous to justify this level of investment." Eric asked the question that had been troubling him since Sarah's discovery. "Are there other people who have disappeared because they got too close to this secret?" Dr. Wells was quiet for a long moment before responding. "There have been other incidents over the years. Hikers who vanished in the Echo Ridge area, researchers whose investigations into Colorado mining history ended abruptly, journalists who started asking questions about classified Cold War projects and then moved on to other topics without explanation." She pulled out a file folder she had been maintaining privately for years. "I've kept track of anything that seemed potentially connected to Daniel's case. Most of these incidents have innocent explanations, but the pattern is ... suggestive." The folder contained newspaper clippings, missing person reports, and academic notices spanning from the 1950s through the early 2000s. Individually, the cases seemed unrelated. Collectively, they suggested a systematic effort to eliminate anyone who came too close to discovering the truth about Echo Ridge. "How many people do you think they've killed?" Sarah asked. "I don't know," Dr. Wells replied. "But based on what you found, Daniel definitely wasn't the first. And he probably wasn't the last." Sarah showed Dr. Wells the most disturbing photograph she had taken in the underground facility, a wall chart showing security incidents by year from 1950 to 1995. The chart used coded language, but the implications were clear. Civilian contacts requiring resolution had occurred regularly throughout the facility's operation. "This isn't just about Daniel," Sarah realized. "It's about dozens of people over 50 years. This facility has been operating as a killing ground for anyone who accidentally discovers it." Dr. Wells examined the chart closely. The frequency increased significantly in the 1980s and early 1990s. Something changed that made the operation more vulnerable to discovery. Eric suggested that improved access to government records and academic research tools might have made it easier for civilians to notice inconsistencies in official histories. The same technological advances that had helped Daniel conduct his research had also made the deep shelter secret harder to maintain. The three investigators spent the next week carefully documenting their findings and developing a strategy for public revelation. They contacted Michael Chen, an investigative journalist with a track record of exposing government cover-ups and arranged to provide him with exclusive access to the evidence. Chen's initial reaction was skepticism. Stories about secret government facilities and assassination programs sounded like conspiracy theories rather than documentable facts. But when he reviewed Sarah's photographs and compared them with Eric's preserved materials from Daniel's research, his attitude changed completely. "This is the kind of story that ends careers," Chen told them during their first meeting. "Either it ends mine because it's too explosive for any editor to publish, or it ends a lot of other people's careers because it exposes crimes that powerful people thought were safely buried." Chen began conducting his own investigation, using his journalistic credentials to access government archives and interview former officials who might have knowledge of Cold War classified projects. His findings corroborated and expanded on what Sarah had discovered. The Deep Shelter Project had been initiated in 1947 as part of a broader effort to develop underground facilities that could serve as command centers or research installations in the event of nuclear war. The Echo Ridge location had been chosen for its geological stability, remote location, and proximity to transportation networks. What made the project unique was its use of a legitimate mining operation as cover for construction activities. The paperwork inconsistencies Daniel had discovered weren't mistakes. They were deliberate obfuscation designed to hide the true nature and scale of the construction work. By 1954, the facility had grown far beyond its original design, incorporating advanced communication systems, underground laboratories, and living quarters capable of supporting a staff of 50 people for extended periods. When the official mining operations were terminated, the underground facility continued operating under deeper cover. Chen's sources suggested that the facility had been used for various purposes over the decades: weapons research, communication, interception, and eventually as a training ground for covert operations personnel. The continuous operation and security requirements had made it increasingly vulnerable to accidental discovery by civilians. The program should have been shut down years ago, one former intelligence official told Chen off the record, but bureaucratic inertia and the sunk cost fallacy kept it running long past its useful life. By the 1990s, it had become more liability than asset. Chen's investigation revealed that Daniel Mercer's murder had been a turning point for the Deep Shelter Project. The attention generated by his disappearance had made continued operation at Echo Ridge untenable. The facility had been gradually scaled back through the 1990s and early 2000s, though skeleton crews continued maintaining the site and monitoring for security breaches. Sarah's discovery of the facility in 2004 had apparently triggered the final shutdown. When Chen attempted to access the hidden entrance using Sarah's directions, he found that it had been permanently sealed with concrete, and the surface area had been thoroughly camouflaged. "They're erasing the evidence," Chen told Sarah during one of their final meetings. "Whatever was happening at Echo Ridge, they've decided it's time to bury it permanently." But the evidence Sarah had collected, combined with Eric's preserved materials and Chen's investigative reporting, was sufficient to expose the truth about Daniel Mercer's murder and the decades-long cover-up that had followed. When Chen's story was published, it generated immediate national attention. The revelation that a government facility had operated in secret for over 50 years, killing civilians to protect its existence, sparked congressional investigations and criminal inquiries. Several former officials were indicted on charges related to the Deep Shelter Project. Though most of the people directly responsible for Daniel's murder had died or disappeared by the time the truth emerged, the families of other victims identified through Dr. Wells' research received official acknowledgement of their losses and financial compensation. Margaret Chen, the motel owner, who had been Daniel's last contact in Silver Hollow, was among those who provided testimony about the atmosphere of fear and secrecy that had pervaded the town for decades. Her courage in speaking publicly helped other residents come forward with their own experiences of intimidation and surveillance. Harold Ruskin, the elderly resident who had made cryptic warnings about buried secrets, had passed away in 2001, taking his knowledge to the grave. But his family provided investigators with documents he had hidden, revealing that he had been recruited as an informant for the Deep Shelter security operation in the 1960s and had struggled with guilt about his role for the rest of his life. The official investigation concluded that at least 12 people had been killed over the years to protect the Deep Shelter secret, with Daniel Mercer being one of the last victims before the program's gradual shutdown. But for Eric Sandler, The most important outcome was simply knowing the truth about what had happened to his friend. The excited phone call that had haunted him for 13 years finally made sense. Daniel had indeed made an incredible discovery, one that had cost him his life, but ultimately exposed a conspiracy that had claimed many other lives over 5 decades. On a cold morning in November 2005, exactly 14 years after Daniel's disappearance, Eric and Sarah hiked to Echo Ridge to place a memorial marker at the spot where Daniel's car had been found. The mountain looked peaceful and innocent, giving no hint of the secrets it had hidden for so long. As they stood in the silence of the Colorado wilderness, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had led her to uncover the truth. A photographer's eye for unusual light had revealed evidence of crimes that powerful people had tried to bury forever. The truth about Daniel Mercer had finally emerged, but it came too late to save him or the others who had died, protecting a secret that should never have existed in the first place. 20 years have passed since Sarah Martinez discovered the truth hidden beneath Echo Ridge. The mountain stands unchanged, its pine-covered slopes offering no visible reminder of the secrets that once festered in its depths. But for those who know where to look, the evidence of what happened there remains etched in the landscape, like scars that refuse to heal. The town of Silver Hollow has transformed in the decades since Daniel Mercer's disappearance became front-page news. What was once an isolated mountain community has evolved into a destination for dark tourism enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists, drawn by the notoriety of the deep shelter revelations. The Pine Ridge Motel, where Daniel spent his final night, now displays a plaque commemorating the victims of what media reports termed the Echo Ridge murders. Margaret Chen, now in her 70s, still operates the motel, though she has mixed feelings about the attention her establishment receives. Visitors often ask to see the room where Daniel stayed, hoping to capture something meaningful with their cameras or recording devices. Margaret accommodates these requests with quiet dignity, understanding that for many people, the story of Daniel Mercer represents something larger than a single tragedy. People want to believe that the truth always comes out eventually, Margaret told a documentary crew in 2019. Daniel's story gives them hope that even the most carefully hidden secrets can't stay buried forever. I think that's why they come here, not just to see where it happened, but to convince themselves that justice is still possible. The congressional investigations that followed Michael Chen's expose revealed the scope of the deep shelter program in bureaucratic detail that somehow made the human cost even more tragic. Classified documents released through Freedom of Information Act requests showed that officials had discussed the civilian problem as early as 1955, acknowledging that maintaining secrecy would require permanent solutions to accidental discoveries. Dr. Patricia Wells, now retired from the University of Colorado, has become an unofficial historian of the Echo Ridge case. Her research has identified 23 individuals whose disappearances or deaths between 1950 and 2004 can be definitively linked to the deep shelter security operation. The actual number is likely higher, as many cases from the early decades lack sufficient documentation for verification. What haunts me most, Dr. Wells explained during a 2020 interview, is how ordinary these people were. They weren't spies or activists or troublemakers. They were hikers, researchers, local residents who asked innocent questions or wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. The system treated their lives as acceptable losses to protect a secret that ultimately had no legitimate national security value. Eric Sandler has found an unexpected calling as an advocate for government transparency and accountability. He works with organizations that help families of victims seek information about classified programs that may have harmed their loved ones. His patient, methodical approach to document analysis skills he developed as a chemistry teacher has proven invaluable in passing the bureaucratic language that agencies use to obscure uncomfortable truths. Daniel would have made an excellent investigative researcher, Eric reflected in 2021, 30 years after his friend's death. He had the persistence and attention to detail that this kind of work requires. In a strange way, continuing his mission feels like keeping him alive. The physical site of the deep shelter facility has been thoroughly sanitized. Environmental remediation teams spent 3 years removing all traces of the underground complex, filling the tunnels with concrete and restoring the surface to its natural state. The area is now part of a designated wilderness preserve, with hiking trails that pass within yards of where the hidden entrance once stood. Sarah Martinez returned to photography after her brief career as an investigative whistleblower, but her work has taken on a different character. Her recent projects focus on landscapes that harbor hidden histories, places where human activities have left invisible marks on the natural world. Her 2018 exhibition, What the Earth Remembers, included several photographs of Echo Ridge, taken during different seasons and times of day. "The mountain looks peaceful now," Sarah said at the exhibition opening, "but I can never see it the same way I did before 2000. When I photograph that ridge, I'm always thinking about the people who died there, the families who never got answers, the decades of lies that were built into the landscape itself. Beauty and tragedy can occupy the same space. The legal aftermath of the deep shelter revelations has been frustratingly incomplete. While several mid-level officials faced criminal charges, most of the people who authorized or carried out the murders had died of natural causes by the time the truth emerged. The institutional mechanisms that enabled the program, classification systems that prevented oversight, legal frameworks that shielded illegal activity, and cultural norms that prioritized secrecy over accountability remained largely unchanged. Michael Chen, the journalist whose reporting exposed the conspiracy, has continued investigating similar cases of government programs that operated outside legal boundaries. His 2015 book, Buried Secrets: The Hidden Cost of National Security, documents dozens of incidents where classified operations harmed civilians without meaningful consequences for the responsible officials. The deep shelter case wasn't an aberration, Chen wrote in his book's introduction. It was a predictable result of systems designed to operate without transparency or accountability. Until we address the structural problems that made Echo Ridge possible, similar tragedies will continue happening in places we haven't discovered yet. The families of deep shelter victims have received financial settlements from the government, though the amounts were determined through confidential negotiations that included non-disclosure agreements. Some families accepted these arrangements, viewing them as the best closure they were likely to receive. Others have continued pressing for fuller disclosure of their loved ones' fates and the circumstances of their deaths. Robert and Susan Mercer, Daniel's parents, used their settlement to establish a scholarship fund for students pursuing research into government accountability and transparency. The Daniel Mercer Memorial Scholarship has supported dozens of young researchers whose work continues the investigation their son began in 1991. Daniel died because he asked inconvenient questions and refused to accept incomplete answers, Robert Mercer said at the scholarship fund's inaugural ceremony in 2007. "The best way to honor his memory is to support others who have the same courage to seek truth, regardless of the consequences." The scholarship recipients have included journalists, historians, legal researchers, and graduate students whose work has exposed other classified programs that violated legal and ethical boundaries. Their investigations have revealed surveillance operations targeting domestic political groups, medical experiments conducted without informed consent, and covert activities that undermined democratic institutions in foreign countries. In Silver Hollow, the older residents who lived through the deep shelter era have gradually been replaced by newcomers drawn by the area's recreational opportunities and dramatic scenery. The culture of silence and fear that once characterized the community has largely disappeared, though some long-term residents still speak carefully about the past. Harold Ruskin's grandson, James, returned to Silver Hollow in 2010 to settle his grandfather's estate and discovered a cache of documents hidden in the basement of the family home. The papers revealed the extent of Harold's involvement with the deep shelter security operation and his growing horror at what he was helping to conceal. "My grandfather kept detailed records of everyone he reported on," James explained during a community meeting in 2012. Visitors who asked questions about the mountains, researchers who showed interest in local history, even neighbors who mentioned seeing strange lights or hearing unusual sounds. He was tortured by guilt about his role in what happened to these people. Harold's records helped investigators identify additional victims and understand how the deep shelter operation maintained control over the local community for decades. The documents showed that several other residents had been recruited as informants, creating a network of surveillance that made it nearly impossible for suspicious activities to go unnoticed. The psychological impact of living under such conditions for decades left lasting scars on the community. Several former residents have described the constant anxiety of wondering whether casual conversations were being reported, whether expressions of curiosity about local history might be interpreted as suspicious, whether their neighbors could be trusted with sensitive information. "We lived in fear without really understanding what we were afraid of," said Maria Santos, who moved away from Silver Hollow in 1995. But returned for the 2012 community meeting. There was always this sense that certain topics were off limits, that asking too many questions could bring unwanted attention. "Looking back, I realize we were living under a form of domestic surveillance that most Americans would find unthinkable." The Echo Ridge case has become a touchstone for researchers studying the intersection of national security, policy, and civil liberty. Academic conferences regularly feature panels analyzing the legal, ethical, and political implications of the Deep Shelter program. The case is cited in law school courses, government oversight training programs, and policy reform proposals aimed at preventing similar abuses. But for all the academic attention and policy discussions, the human dimension of the story remains its most powerful element. Daniel Mercer was 21 years old when he made his final phone call to Eric Sandler, excited about discoveries that would cost him his life. The enthusiasm in his voice that night, preserved in Eric's memory for more than 3 decades, represents something irreplaceable that was lost when institutional paranoia prioritized secrecy over human life. The memorial marker that Eric and Sarah placed on Echo Ridge in 2005 has become an unofficial pilgrimage site for people affected by government abuse and cover-ups. Visitors leave flowers, stones, and handwritten notes expressing their own experiences with institutional betrayal, or their hopes for greater transparency and accountability. One note, left by the parent of a soldier killed in a classified operation, read, "Daniel, thank you for showing us that the truth can survive, even when good people don't. Your courage helped expose lies that had been hidden for 50 years. Maybe someday we'll live in a country where asking questions isn't a death sentence." As winter approaches Echo Ridge in 2024, the mountain prepares for another season of silence and snow. The trails will become impassable, the tourist traffic will disappear, and the landscape will return to the austere beauty that has attracted visitors for generations. But beneath the peaceful surface, the memory of what happened there continues to resonate. On clear nights, when the wind carries sound across the valley, some visitors still report hearing faint echoes from the direction of the ridge, not the supernatural phenomena that local folklore might suggest, but something more unsettling. The sound of voices calling names that no one answers. The echo of questions that powerful people tried to silence forever. The truth about Daniel Mercer and the others who died at Echo Ridge has been told, documented, and officially acknowledged. Justice, in the form of legal accountability and financial compensation, has been partially achieved. But the deeper questions raised by their deaths, about the balance between security and transparency, about the rights of citizens to seek truth, about the moral cost of institutional secrecy, remain as relevant today as they were in 1991. In Silver Hollow, Margaret Chen continues operating her motel, serving coffee to visitors who come seeking understanding of a tragedy that happened before many of them were born. She has learned that some stories never really end, they just become part of the landscape, woven into the collective memory of a place and its people. Every winter, when the snow starts falling, I think about that young man who never made it home, Margaret said recently, standing in the motel parking lot where Daniel Mercer loaded his car for the last time. I think about all the questions he still had, all the discoveries he never got to make, all the people who loved him and had to live with not knowing what happened. She paused, watching snowflakes begin their slow descent from the darkening sky. The mountain remembers, even when we try to forget. And maybe that's enough, that the truth survives, that the silence finally spoke, that someone cared enough to keep asking questions until the answers came. In the end, Daniel Mercer's legacy isn't found in the documents that exposed a conspiracy or the policies that were reformed in response to his death. It lives in the principle he embodied, that seeking truth is worth the risk, that some questions must be asked, regardless of the consequences, and that even the most carefully guarded secrets cannot survive the persistent curiosity of those who refuse to accept incomplete answers. The snow continues falling on Echo Ridge, covering the landscape in pristine white that will remain until spring reveals what winter has hidden. But the truth about what happened there has emerged from its long burial, and no amount of snow can cover it again.